Good evening. Wow, look at all you people here on a Sunday night. Did I shame you or something this morning? Say. No. Danny, he chimes in. Book of Leviticus tonight. Just an observation. I don't know about any of you, but let me ask you this way. As far as the first 5 books are concerned, how many of you would consider yourself to know, kind of have at least an operational knowledge of what's the content of the law and, the things that are covered in each of the books? Okay. More of you may answer that in the affirmative. If I was just to say, okay, there's offerings that need to be done and how they deal with sin and the idea of a priesthood and all that stuff. So we all kind of, okay. When you consider all of the things that they were supposed to know and do, the idea of keeping the law, if we were having to do all of that stuff, do you ever think about that? Man, oh man, I think it would modify your behavior pretty quick. Yeah, it would tend to get your attention a little bit more. And so as much as we are thankful for grace, you will be more so as we study through this particular book and the ones that come after it. I also want to say that there is an enormous, incredible beauty to this as well, because this is what would have taken place if people were keeping themselves in a, God says, basically you can boil it down to this. God says to the priesthood, you do that. God says to the people, you do this. And so the priesthood would mediate, but the people were supposed to operate and govern themselves in a particular way, and God gives real specific instructions to this. And whenever they fall short, then the sacrifices come in and all the rest of that. But can you imagine that if you were having to have your sin reconciled by sacrifice and offering of animals and watching that go on all the time? Making me really nervous. Not because it's Mark. Yeah, don't pay attention to the man behind the curtain. Thanks for that one, Stella. It's probably because they left something up there that was going to go off at some point. So they're taking care of me. They do such nice things. So anyway, when you really consider what it would be like to live under this particular type of life, it was going to focus the mind quite a bit. Now, I didn't print out, I should have got a copy of the tabernacle. Is there a possibility, do you guys have any of those leftover images of what the tabernacle looked like? That might not be a bad idea. Because this is going to take place in the tabernacle. I didn't think about it. I brought a copy of mine because I just wanted to kind of orient myself with some of the things that were where it was laid out and all the rest of it. Because there are some, when you look at this, there are some really specific bits of information that are given in this. So while they look for that, Leviticus chapter 1 is where we start. And let's remember, we'll familiarize ourselves where we are at this point. The giving of the law has already taken place, right? He's already given the specifics for how you're to put together the tabernacle. And so not only did he give the specifics for the pieces and how it was to be made, but they've already set it up. And so it's in its place. It's functioning. And now what you get at Leviticus is a re-emphasizing of the offerings. Now the first of the offerings that are mentioned here, it's going to go chapters 1 through 7, is going to deal with 5 offerings. The first one is the burnt offering, and it's not as though it hasn't been around before. Exodus 29 goes through it with a lot of detail. There's something else to remember about this. The idea of a burnt offering was something that would be offered to God and totally consumed. They were doing burnt offerings all the way back in Abraham's time. But it wasn't because God had given specific written instruction. So when we read through the book of Leviticus, here's something that's really easy to forget and miss if you're just reading it kind of devotionally and it's not pointed out or you don't necessarily notice. This is almost entirely a book that is narrated directly from God to Moses. Here's what I want you to do. So the breakdown of the book, we'll get to it in just a moment, but it will start in, like I say, the first 7. Perfect. I see it. You just popped it up there. Okay, well that would be that's the inner part. There's an outer court to this as well. I don't know. There you go. Thanks, gentlemen. See, you guys keep all that stuff that I spam you up with. Thank you. It's good to know it's up there. Okay, so here's one of the things. When we look at something from north, south, east, and west, we would know, like, think of the United States. North, south, west. It's hard for me to do it because I'm on the opposite side. West, east, right? Is that correct in your orientation? Well, no, it is. Because west is here for me. For you, west is here. Doing the chicken dance thing. So, north, south, to you guys, west, east. Yeah? I'm doing this for your sake there, man. Because to me, this is west. I'm talking about, we're looking at the, okay. And here I ask for audience participation. I'm not talking about where we are in this building when you're looking at a map of the United States. Or anything as you look at it in its orientation, north, south. If you're looking at the picture as I would of the United States, to your orientation, west, east. So, I probably didn't make that clear for you in the first place. What you have here, in the orientation of, because it comes up in the text, and that's why I have it here, and we'll keep it up there. When you look at this, this would be the tabernacle, and this is where the offerings are. So you enter in from the east. The east is there. The north is that way. South is this way. West is that way. Okay, so the tabernacle of meeting and where the Ark of the Covenant would be and all that stuff, that's to the west. That all comes into play in just the burnt offerings. Where were they going to take place? It's so specific. And here's the important part that we take away from that. What God tells of the priesthood to do, I want you to do this, and I want you to do that, and here's where you'll do it, here's how you'll do it, here's who can be involved, here's what you're going to wear, this is the time of year that it's going to be, this kind of offering requires that kind of offering requires that. We studied it in Exodus. You definitely see it in full view here in Leviticus, all for this reason, that God says, there's no other ways, this is what I accept. Don't make it up as you go along. I've given you specific instructions, right? You get that definitely when you look at the text. Now, that also becomes very, very important for our understanding in that he gives those kinds of such detailed information. Do you not find it interesting, you've heard me say it before, for those people that say that there is a modern priesthood? Really, where is the New Testament equivalent to Leviticus or Exodus or the other places where you have this kind of detail for offerings? And again, what they wear, where they stand, where when, imagine this, what we're going to read today, when an offering is brought and they're going to remove its skin, or with the animal, or with the birds, they're going to remove its feathers, they're going to tell you what side of the altar to put it on, north, south, east, or west. There's that kind of detail to it. And yet, today's modern priesthood, as we hear some say it, there's nothing in the New Testament that gives a fraction of the amount of detail of what is expected of a priesthood. And so we take that to our understanding of the book of Hebrews, and it helps us in our understanding that in Jesus we have a great high priest, one who mediates for us, making this null and void, not necessary, because this was being repeated all the time. They were moving that tabernacle as they moved from Sinai towards the promised land, and once they got there, and even with a permanent temple, those things were still happening constantly, all around the clock. That isn't happening anymore, nor does God ask it to happen anymore. So we have these people that would say, well, you Christians, you believe in the God that was always wanting animals to be put to death and their blood to be shed and this, that, and all the rest of it. And you say, yeah, we believe in the same God of the Old Testament. He's the same one of the New, but none of that stuff is necessary anymore. And if for some reason he liked that, we'd still be doing it. What he has shown us is that it is totally unnecessary. And it helps us in looking at the Old Testament types that it was saying that there would be a day when this would no longer be necessary. So this speaks of Jesus, no question about it. And we will see that as we work through this. You see it in the first 4 verses. So having turned to Leviticus 1, let's have a word of prayer and a few other observations, then we'll look at the text. Father, we thank you so much for gathering us in this place, and how there are those who would minimize the teaching and the understanding, the knowledge of what we find in the Old Testament, because we are, quote, not under that covenant. And yet, what we see all throughout the Old Testament gives us better understanding for the new. And so we ask that as we come before you and as we study your word, that you would open our eyes to the reality that we have as believers and what has been done for us in the person of Jesus, that he was the perfect fulfillment of all that the law had presented. We give you thanks. We give you all praise and honor. Ask that you would glorify yourself through the teaching of your word tonight, and we ask it in Jesus' name. Amen? Okay, so chapter 1 of Leviticus. I had mentioned this morning, if you were here, that atonement is very simply the fancy word for what happened with Jesus. It was his blood that atoned for sin. And that wasn't just a New Testament thing. The idea of atonement goes back to these times. And really what atonement would ultimately be, if you look at it, you just think, okay, it is the innocent who is paying the price of the guilty. So in this case, you want to say, okay, if it's an ox, or if it's a sheep or a goat, or if it's a turtle dove or a pigeon, are they guilty of anything that requires their life? No. But God wasn't asking us to be sacrificed. He was having something that didn't have knowledge of what it had done, or what we had done, yet it was paying the price. And it was important for the people who were doing that. It would be a recognition immediately, all the time, that my failure and my guilt has caused this to take place. Not because the animal had done something wrong. I'm the guilty party. So the blood of these animals was going to atone for sin, but not for theirs. It was for mine. It was done as a substitute for what I had deserved. So you add to atonement the word substitutionary. It was done as a substitute. So in the person of Jesus, his atonement is, again, not for his guilt. And again, if you've never had a chance to study through the book of Hebrews, fascinating that in every conceivable way, the argument that is made by the writer of Hebrews is to people with an understanding of that Hebrew heritage and that background who had come into a knowledge of the person of Jesus, yet they were entertaining the idea of potentially going back to that system. And so the writer of Hebrews says, well, let's look at the system itself, and let's look at all of its failings and all of its shortcomings and how Jesus is the perfect fulfillment of all of those Old Testament types. So don't go back to something that can't save you and cannot take care of these problems. You get a good understanding of that when you look through, again, Leviticus. We start in chapter 1 with the burnt offerings. And what I want to do is also take a look in the New Testament at a couple of verses that deal with the law. One last thing I think of, and I didn't write down the reference, but can you remember in the Psalms, one of the Psalms where David says that the law of the Lord is perfect, converting the soul? You ever heard that phrase? Okay. To David, that's a total reality. And yet the book of Hebrews would say, but the law never made anyone free. Why? Because no one was ever able to keep the law. So it could never bring about freedom in the sense spiritually. That's why it was always being repeated. All of the sacrifices and all that stuff was happening over and over and over again. So for us, when we look at this, we will say, for me personally, the law of the Lord is a frustration to me. It's perfect, it's beautiful, it is actual, it's wonderful, it is all of those things, but it's frustrating to me because I can't measure up to it. How about any of you? The more you read the law, you just go, this is impossible. And Paul would say, I agree. In Galatians chapter 4, we will look there at his argument for that, and it's a very, very important one. But we also want to remember one other thing too. For those who would say that we keep the law, then we need to see, as James would say, we don't need to turn there, but James chapter 2, you can write it down as your reference. At verse 10, he's talking about that we should do these things. And yet there are people, if they trust in those, he would tell you in chapter 2, verse 10, that as far as keeping the law, if you're going to say that you keep the law and you infringe on one part of it, you're guilty of all of it. Because it requires perfection. You must do so perfectly at all times, or you're a violator of all of the law if you're a violator of any of the law. So that doesn't necessarily convert the soul to the new believer. The new believer comes running to Jesus and says, I cannot do this. And then Jesus says, I did, so you can lean on me and I'm the one who will save you, but that doesn't give us license to be however we want to be. He expects a measure of holiness and righteousness and changed life and walking with him. That is all implied, right? So, Leviticus chapter 1. The book we call Leviticus kind of derives from the Greek and then into the Hebrew. It is, of course, a reference to the Levites or the priests. But if you look at what the Jewish people would call it, it's really taken from the beginning words of it, as you see here. Now the Lord called to Moses. So it would be considered as he called, or and God called. So if you're trying to look at the name of the book, it means and so God called. Well, of course, we know who God is and we know to whom he called, and that, of course, was Moses. So what you're going to get is the law has been given as Moses has received it. We studied it through Exodus. Now what we have in Leviticus is, let's put it into its proper order. Here's what's to be expected. Let me go through what the chapters are going to cover. Chapters 1 through 7 deal with the 5 different types of offerings. By the time that you get to chapters 8 through 10, it is the installment of the high priest and the priesthood. So it's Aaron and his sons. It's their functions, the things that they're supposed to do. Chapters 11 through 16 is how you deal with things that are unclean and what you're supposed to do when encountering, or if you have yourself become unclean, and that what you need to do to get away from that and have yourself cleansed. And then verses 11 through 27 is a lot of detail about personal and practical holiness of the nation, of the people, and all of that. So it's all dealt with in those basic 4 sections. And it really is kind of, it's not all over the place. It really reads as a continuing kind of a narrative. It starts out with the sacrificial systems that's going to lead to the priesthood needing to do what it does, and then how it is that you deal with your uncleanness. The priesthood is in place. God gives his prescription that leads to holiness in the nation and of the people. So that's how it will progress through. The chapters, for the most part, are pretty short, so you can get through them pretty quickly. But we find some incredibly important things as we get to some of the chapters, 11, 14. There are some really very, very important things that we'll get to. So, let's see. Verse 1. Now, the Lord called to Moses, and he spoke to him from the tabernacle of meeting, saying. Now you see in the very first verse there, you get the word he spoke to him, and here's what he said. So this is going to set forth a pattern for the rest of the book, where this is direct communication from God directly to Moses, and then it was to be told to the people. So he's going to deal with the idea of burnt offerings and 3 different types of animals that could be brought. So you can read through these, and Exodus deals with them. We'll have a lot more detail as we go through. That this is not just this chapter where it's dealt with burnt offerings and the types of offerings. There'll be more mentions of these things as we work through the book. But it says, now speak to the children of Israel and say to them, when one of you brings an offering to the Lord, you will bring your offering of the livestock, of the herd, and of the flock. So he'll get into those different things. A burnt offering is something that would be consumed on the altar. So they would have to, as you're going to see, they'd have to put fire to it. And there was so much that was done in the way of how the animal was prepared for the sacrifice. It's not just you kill it and you throw it on there until it turns to ash. Not even that. And that would be pretty much like what the pagans would have done. Probably the way that they had done it before this instruction here. We don't have a lot of detail, but boy, when he gives you this, the way that it would even be presented for a burnt offering is very, very descriptive. So here's where you get to the point of the substitution part of it, where you really understand how this relates to the New Testament. Now, verse 3 says, now if the offering is a burnt sacrifice of the herd, let him offer a male without blemish. We're going to find out in a verse or two that it is a bull. And it says, now he will offer it of his own free will. Make sure you either underline that or make your little note next to it, because it's going to be, here are the qualifications. It is going to have to be a male without blemish. Now, I want to do this in a step-by-step way, and let's see how Jesus fits all of this criteria. Jesus, clearly a male, without spot, without blemish. Now, the spot or blemish isn't about the physical appearance, because we know that what he did to settle the issue of a spiritual matter. So we know from the text, from the New Testament, all throughout, we know that he was absolutely perfect always kept the law, did everything he was supposed to. In fact, there was never sin in him. Now, of course, that's not really that difficult for us to understand. He is God. He is incapable of sin. Well, what about when he turned over the tables at the temple? Well, what about it? There was something wrong with that? He was furious, no question. But can you be angry without sinning? Sure. Paul tells you that. Says, be angry and do not sin. Yeah, I mean, do you guys get angry at sin itself and the causes that comes from it and all the rest of that? So anger's not the issue. But anger that is not righteously applied, yeah, then you got a problem with that. That was not his problem. So he was a perfect, unblemished sacrifice for us. From all we know, he may very well have been unblemished in the physical sense. He certainly wasn't after the resurrection. He was plenty blemished. And how did he get all of his blemishes? At the hands of man. That happened during his interrogation, his beating, his crucifixion, his scourging, all that stuff. As we know from Isaiah 53, he was marred beyond recognition. We get that from Pilate's words. Behold the man. That's his way of saying, isn't this enough? And what do they say? Away with him, crucify him. That wasn't enough. So his blemishes that we know of all came because of these other things. So he's able to present himself as a male without blemish. There was nothing in him that was sinful. He was perfect. And it is, again, there are sometimes I think it's helpful for our understanding of what we read in the text if you could almost look at it from God's perspective as he would see human events. Because if you think of Jesus coming over the Mount of Olives, it's one of my favorite places in Israel. It's obviously changed since his times, though there are pieces of it that you can still see from his time. But when he comes up over the Mount of Olives, wherever it may have been on what we call the triumphal entry, the day of his triumphal entry, it says he comes over the Mount of Olives. We know where it is. He looks at the temple. We know where that is. We know that he's coming from Bethany. We know where that is. And so as he comes over that, he's coming in as the Passover lamb, the sacrifice. From God's perspective, it's his way of saying, here is my offering for the sin of mankind, my son Jesus, who is perfect, he's without spot, and he's without blemish, and he was to be examined. Because every animal that was going to be offered at Passover was going to have to be examined to see that it was without spot or blemish. So from God's perspective, you know this. He's looking and he's saying, my offering for mankind, my offering for sin. Examine him, look at who he is. See what he is and what he represents, and see that he is indeed perfect in every ceremonial possible way, because he's going to be given at the end of that week, and it would deal with the issue of sin, that this would not have to be repeated. How crazy is that? It's just, to the mind, it is a mind-boggling thing to consider. So here it is. Now this offering, this burnt offering, verse 3, of the herd, let him offer a male who is without blemish, and offer it of his own free will. Very important. So the person who is going to make this sacrifice is going to do so of his own free will. He's not going to have it forced upon him. He will also know that if he doesn't do this, then he's outside of the commonwealth of the people. He will not be of the nation. He is separated from the nation because there's no atonement that's taken place. Right? So again, as we look at this, there's an offering that's being made on behalf of the person, but it has to be a deal of free will, which is a pretty interesting thing when you stop to consider those who say that the Christian has no free will and that God has made every decision for him. Well, that breaks with Leviticus 1:3, where it tells you this person does this of his own free will, brings his offering, knowing full well that it is he who needs to make sure it meets this qualification, a male without blemish, and of my own free will I present this animal on behalf of me and my sin. That's what's there. So, again, putting Jesus into that. Of a free will, we see Jesus, the one sacrificed, and we identify with his sacrifice. Of our free will. Notice that there's more to it. He will do so at the door of the tabernacle of meeting before the Lord. Now this is outside. Now here's one of the reasons why, again, even this. think about, it's a pretty confined space. If you want to see what the measurements of it, think of a bull, and they're not all that easy to deal with, right? Especially if they get a little bit nervous. Look at what is here, because if you look to the south, there's a staircase that would come off so that they could get up to the altar. If it's to the east, that's where the ashes would be, as they're having to remove the ashes from the burnt offerings. It would have the feathers and the covering of the birds as they are offered, and that's going to be to the east. To the north is about the only open space, and you'll see that that's where you were able to offer the smaller livestock that would be easier to deal with, the rams or the goats and the sheep. But if you try to do something like this to the west, there's the laver. You don't want to go having your bull running around and breaking stuff and knocking things over, so it's done outside. Bulls are a pretty big deal, right? So you've been around them. They're not easy to manage. Everything else would have been. So you get the point? Okay, so outside the tabernacle of meeting then, look at this. Then he shall put his hand on the head of the burnt offering, and it will be accepted on his behalf to make atonement for him. So again, recognition. Why would you put your hand on the head of the animal? Should be pretty obvious. It's your way of recognizing, I know what's about to happen. This is your way of acknowledging my guilt to this animal's innocence. It is a full recognition, though I'm sure that there are some who may have gone through the motions, and there's a caution against such things. That this would be a way of, if you were, some people would call it transferal. I don't want to make it too mystical. It should be for the person that would be doing it. I don't know about you, I love animals. If I walk up to an animal and I'm putting a bull or something like that, if I put my hand on its head, it probably isn't all that, interested in me anyway. But I love them, to just be around them and all the rest of that. The idea of me putting my hand on that animal's head, realizing what is about to come next, changes that entire experience. Doesn't it? Because you know what's coming. That animal has no clue, but you know what's coming. So your hand is on its head, and you would do this for the burnt offering. And then notice that it will be accepted. If all the criteria is met, and you're not just going through the motions, then it's acceptable as far as God is concerned. Now let's remember why that is. Two things in operation here. One is because he prescribed it to be this way, and you're being obedient to the prescription. But it would also mean that if you're going to go through all of this, that you understand the reason for it, and you're doing this because of obedience to the Lord, and you want reconciliation. So it says, it is going to be accepted on his behalf. So there is the recognition of the individual, and not that it's some corporate thing. That's why it had to be brought by the individuals and not just by someone on behalf of the nation. They had offerings for that. This is the burnt offering for the individuals. And so we read, it says that it will be accepted on his behalf, not for everyone else. It's on his behalf, or if he's the household, to make atonement for him. Okay, so there's your word once again, atonement. Now, people love to say, well, is there another word that you can use for atonement? And it really is it really kind of translates just like this, at one meant. It's a reconciliation, atonement, at one. You're atoned, you're reconciled. And the recognition to this is that you could be unreconciled no sooner do you leave the tent. And then all of these things are once again repeated. They, like we, it's the same problem. It's the human condition that we may, with all good intention, come before the Lord and renounce our sin and ask for forgiveness and reconciliation, but fall right back into the same things. And yet we know that the Lord says, for the person that will come to him, we don't sin with impunity. But we know that at all times that he is always willing to accept us when we come before him and seek forgiveness and reconciliation. Now, verse 5 tells us that he will kill the bull before the Lord, outside of the eastern part. And then, so it would be before the Lord and the priests. And then Aaron's sons will bring the blood and sprinkle the blood all around on the altar that is by the door of the tabernacle of meeting. So again, Exodus 29 is where you can find this implemented. The first time that there was formal instruction given to this. Let me say it again. This was in operation. They were doing burnt offerings before, but here in this case, God says, on those offerings, here's how I want them to be done. This is how they are to be carried out. So they'll carry it in, they will sprinkle it, and remember, this is a matter of blood. So this is the idea of guilt for innocence. And if you read this, and if you don't know anything about the New Testament, you would go, but why? What's the need for this? What's the importance of this? Can't they just come before God and say, I'm sorry, I've done what I've done, and I'm just asking for your forgiveness? Well, yeah, they could, but that's not what he prescribes, because this is a foreshadowing of what is to come. This is telling us of Jesus. And we're going to find in Leviticus where we get, you've heard the phrase that I've given the blood as an atonement, that life is in the blood. That's from Leviticus. That's chapter 17. So that has there's a whole section that is dedicated just to that, and the idea that life being in the blood. And so this is life for life. Because sin before God of a person who knows that they have done that, it's a life for life thing. The sentence, the wages of sin is death, right? Romans? All right. And we know all have sinned. But if the wages of sin is death, then the gift of God, we talked about it this morning, is reconciliation through the person of Jesus Christ. Great. So how did that happen? Well, it's been being done from the beginning. And here you have the same principle in place in its imperfect form, now perfected in the person of Jesus Christ. So, here's an interesting thing. We're going to find out why this is later on in the offerings. And it says, when we get to chapter 7 at verse 8, you'll understand why this is. So, he will take the skin of the burnt offering and cut it into pieces. So, what was going to be happening, you'll see there's some additions to this. When they were going to cut the skin off of it, they would cut it up basically to the neck, and they would leave the legs alone, and so the rest of the pelt would be removed from the animal first. We would find that would go to the priest. And so the person who is doing the offering, it would be his. And of course, pelts of animals had all kinds of value, plus warmth and all the rest of it. But that would become something that would be the possession of the priest. As for the rest of it, it was going to be dismembered and put up on the altar, and that's what we get these details here too. Again, can I mention how gruesome this is? Gruesome. Gruesome. And yet, let's remember, why was this being done? Sin. It's gruesome what happens as a result of sin. So again, if this was being done, if you guys were bringing bulls and goats and sheep and doves and pigeons every Sunday, you'd probably think a little bit more about what you do when you leave. So would I. Which is why we should never take the cross for granted. Oh, goodness. Never. So, skin the burnt offering, and then they would cut it into pieces. And then the sons of Aaron, the priest, would put fire on the altar and lay the wood in order on the fire. Now, when these were going on, they had to keep doing this, because that had to be a very hot fire, because it was going to consume and then turn to ash the offering. Then the priests, Aaron's sons, they will lay the parts, the head and the fat in order on the wood that is on the fire upon the altar. But he shall wash its entrails and its legs with water. Well, because the skin was not being taken off of the legs, so there was a cleansing and a cleaning of that. And then also the entrails. What is that? That means that they're removing all the feces and stuff like that. So they're cleaning all of that stuff out because it's going to be offered before the Lord. Okay, so they had to clean all that. Imagine being this guy. All right, so Aaron's sons lay the parts, the head, and the fat in order on the wood, and the leg, but they shall wash the entrails and the legs with water, and the priest will burn all of it on the altar as a burnt sacrifice. There's the important part. An offering made by fire, which is a sweet aroma to the Lord. Now, people would look at that and say, well, of course, with all the fat and the meat and everything else, it smell wonderful. That's not the issue, because God's not going to partake of this. It is what is taking place in the spiritual sense that is the sweet-smelling aroma. Now, they would recognize it because they would see this ascending up, the smoke from it. Yeah, this is like, unless you're like vegetarian or vegan or whatever, man, this is barbecue. What is wrong with that? Nothing. The smell of it is just fantastic, right? It is what is taking place that it is reconciling man, but as God sees it, he's saying, yeah, this is temporary though. You want to know what the sweet aroma to the Lord is his son being offered and sin being omitted. ruined, taken away, crushed on behalf of the believer, so that there is now reconciliation and direct access between God, who loves his creation, and that creation who has come to him for atonement. That's what he loves. Because again, once we're there with him, none of these things are going to even be a remembrance, but everything that made it possible for us to get to him was done in the person of his Son, and God sees the end of these things, and this is what is sweet to him. Now, it tells us in verse 10, now, if his offering is of the flocks, of a sheep, or of goats, as a burnt sacrifice, then he shall bring the male without blemish. Let me point out a couple of other things about this. You'll notice that there are some things kind of omitted. It's not going to say that they have to stoke the fire. There are some things that are just implied. Let's make sure we understand this. All of these offerings would have to meet the same criteria. They would still be offered. They would have to quarter it, take it apart into its component pieces, drain it of its blood, remove it of its skin. All of that was still being done. Even if it's not said in the specifics, it was kind of done, depending on the animal, in much the same way. There are just a little bit of differences in this, which we'll get to in just a moment. So, they will bring a male without blemish, that stays in place, and he shall kill it on the north side of the altar before the Lord and the priests. And so again, as we look at this picture here, so why in that place? The north is really about the only thing that doesn't have anything other than the tables that are there. There are no ashes and no feathers, which would be to the east. And then to the south, there wouldn't be the steps to have to deal with and negotiate. You wouldn't put it close to the laver, because there would be other things as you would between the altar and the Holy of Holies. So the north is the place where you could do this. And you're not going to have to worry about trying to wrestle a goat or a sheep. You can handle that kind of an animal that you couldn't with a bull. That's the most logical reason why, because we're not given any reason for this. It just seems that it logically fits. So take that for what you will. If we needed to know for sure, God would have told us. It just seems practically that makes the sense. So it says, but he will kill it on the north side of the altar before the Lord, and the priests, Aaron's sons, will sprinkle its blood all around the altar, on the altar. And then he shall cut it into pieces with its head and its fat, and the priests will lay them in order on the wood that is on the fire upon the altar. But he shall wash the entrails and the legs with water. Then the priest will bring it all and burn it on the altar as a burnt sacrifice and an offering made by fire, a sweet aroma to the Lord. So that's a repetition of what we saw with the bull. So you get an idea that these same things needed to take place. Now, since the idea was cleanness, removing of the outer skin, there wasn't much to be seen as unclean in the rest of the animal, except for what would be the entrails, and that's why that is cleaned. And so what about the legs? Because the fur is still left on that. Remember, they washed that. So everything had its function and its place. It was done for specific reasons. All of this was so thoroughly and completely thought out. So let me mention again, the idea that there would be a modern priesthood with no directions, even resembling remotely this, just doesn't stand up to even basic reason. Doesn't make any sense. So when people say that there's a modern priesthood, really, ask them this question. Just read through the ending chapters of Exodus and all through Leviticus and tell me why God, especially, think about it this way, especially if these are priests of Jesus Christ, how much more important is that ministry of a priesthood than this one, and yet God would have instituted one with no direction? No way. Just no way. Okay, so chapter 7, verse 14. And if the burnt sacrifice is of an offering to the Lord and is of birds, then he will bring his offerings of turtle doves and young pigeons. And you would notice that these provisions are put in if a person didn't have the ability to afford sheep or goat or whatever else, then they could offer these too. So if people were impoverished or didn't have much, they were able to do this as well. Well, we get this. The priest will bring it to the altar, wring off its head. Now, there would need to be a very specific way of doing this too. This probably means just wringing its neck, which kills it, right? Then you're not having to fight the thing. But notice that it is also still very, very much in keeping with what we've already read. The priest will bring it to the altar, wring off its head, and burn it on the altar. Its blood will be drained out at the side of the altar. Now, it's not going to be caught in a basin. It's just a bird. There's not much there. And yet, it was still to have its blood be shed and atone. So, you will remove its crop with its feathers and cast it beside the altar on the east into the place for ashes. So again, this would be, why do this to the north? Well, the east would be a difficult place to access because that's where the ashes are. They were taken from the altar and put there, and then they would ultimately be taken out later as they cooled and as you had to make room for the next bunch that were going to happen. So you're going to put the feathers, and any of you guys that have hunted, I know that they've got that kind of down to a science, that you can basically remove all of the meat from an animal or from a bird, right, just in one piece, and everything comes off. Well, I don't know. I've never tried it, but I've seen people do it. It's gnarly. That's a word for it, right? Oh, gosh. See, I like eating all that stuff, but don't ask me to go get it myself. I'm just too country boy, or city boy, rather, for that. Well, anyway, remove its crop, its feathers, cast it beside the altar that's to the east with the ashes, and then you will split it at the wings, which means you just lay it open. But you will not divide it completely, and the priest will burn it on the altar on the wood that is on the fire, and it is a burnt sacrifice, an offering made by fire, a sweet aroma to the Lord. So all three have that closing portion that explains this is what is acceptable. It's an aroma. It's sweet smelling as far as God is concerned. It's a way of him saying it's acceptable. Why? Because A, it's his prescription, and B, you've been obedient to it. And you've done these things, and you recognize why they're being done in the first place. So do you really think that people that would be playing the game would go through the motions here? Why would you? To what end? This is why I think it's so very important that we have a full understanding of what it is to live as a New Testament believer, and make sure that we recognize that there's no other way other than what the Bible has prescribed to be right before him. So if it's the matter of salvation and it's our walking with him, think of all the people who say we can be saved, but we need to do this, 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 and this. Usually it comes to people's actions. That's not what God had prescribed. That's you, in this sense, doing it a totally opposite way. That's bringing a blemished animal. That's doing all kinds of other things. Now, even in their history, think forward a long way. Remember what this is. Where are we in the chronology of things? Where we are in the chronology of things is if you're looking at a map of the world, they've come out of Egypt, they've made it over to Sinai. They're going to be moving their way up to come into the land, and most of these people wouldn't even see the land that they were going to come to. But what we do know is that they get there, actually, if you think about it, Joshua and Caleb, depending on their ages and all that stuff, but the kids wouldn't have even been born by this time that would have made it into the promised land. Kick that one around a little bit. This is a 40-year pilgrimage. This is what they were to do as they're making their way into the land. And so God gives the law at Sinai. They're still in, coming out of Egypt, and they're in what is modern day kind of Saudi Arabia, Jordan, that whole area. And they're moving their way north. So he gives this prescription. This is going to follow them in their 40 years in the wilderness and then into the promised land. Once they eventually get there, they would still be doing these things all the way up to Jesus' time. Given the times, of course, when they're taken out of the land, I know all that stuff. But I mean, this was the Jewish law of atonement. And this was the burnt offering that is offered for them. Now, there are a couple of things that I want to point out as we get to kind of some close of this. I mentioned Galatians. I said chapter 4. It's chapter 3. So let's get to Galatians. And Paul deals with this. So, when we read what we've read in Leviticus, I want to make sure that we are reminded of how serious God takes this. So, if you put yourself in the place of the person having to do this, you would have a full recognition of this is what is required for me to stay in a right place with all the other offerings that would go on to. And if you find yourself of getting into a place of uncleanness, of all the things that you would have to do to get to a place of cleanness and all the rest of that, you would realize God is not playing games here. He's very serious, and this is what it takes to walk honorably and rightly before him. And you've got to remember all of these things, and you would be in full understanding the moment that you violated that at all. Again, it's the brilliance and it's the wonderful bit of grace that it is so easy for us to sometimes forget what it cost. So I'm thankful for grace. I don't want to abuse that grace because it came at an enormous cost. When I look at this, I am much more appreciative of that reality, right? So the idea of trying to keep the law or do things that are pleasing to God and think that that's somehow a means of salvation, if you think that's the case, you've not read the Scriptures, right? Now, Galatians helps us in our understanding of this. We could read most of the entire chapter of this, but this will give you a little bit of a flavor of why he was using this argument with the church at Galatia. Let's do a little bit of background on this. This is the beginning of Paul's ministry, the first place that he went to as the one that God had used to take the message to the world that was known at the time in the Gentile sense. The first place that he went to was the churches of Galatia. So from your perspective, if he's in Antioch, right here at the tip of the Mediterranean where Syria meets Turkey, he's in Antioch, and then he goes this way across the Mediterranean above the island of Cyprus, and he comes to what would be the southern coast of modern-day Turkey, and he works his way directly north. It's kind of in the center of the country. What he called Asia Minor, and what they called Asia Minor, is to us modern-day Turkey. So in this place is where he would have met Timothy. This is the places of Lystra, Iconium, Derbe, those kind of places that you hear mentioned in his first missionary journey. He also went there in his second, but he did that by land instead of by water. Okay? So that's this church area. One of the things that we know that happened with Paul, especially the closer that he would have been to Israel and Jerusalem in particular, the people that would come in right behind him were referred to as Judaizers. And these would be the guys that would come in and say, yeah, we know what Paul's talking about, and yeah, there's truth to it and all that stuff, but you still need to keep elements of the law. So Galatians, as he writes back to this church, knowing that the Judaizers have come in, he's giving them reasons to don't listen to them. He's giving them reasons not to listen to them. He's saying, don't listen. And here are the arguments. Chapter 3, verse 1 begins this. Hugely important thing for him to say. "O foolish Galatians, who has bewitched you, that you should not obey the truth, before whose eyes Jesus Christ was clearly portrayed among you as crucified? This only do I want to learn from you. Did you receive the Spirit by the works of the law or by the hearing of faith?" So this is his beginning, his opening salvo in this little way of trying to appeal to them and help them to understand going back to the law will be completely unnecessary. He's going to talk about the sacrifice of Jesus. Because look at what he says. "Are you so foolish? Having begun in the Spirit, are you now going to be made perfect by the flesh?" Great question. So he came to them and said, I'm here to preach Jesus crucified, resurrected, and there is life in him. So he says, did you come into that relationship by your works or did you come into it by faith? So he says, I want to know who it is that's lied to you. Are you going to be made perfect by works of the flesh or is it going to be by a work of the Spirit? Perfect argument. Perfect argument. So he goes on and he explains that there are a number of things. He's going to go back into the history. He mentions Abraham, as you see. He starts that at around verse 7. But let me get to verse, let's say 15. "Brethren, I speak in this manner, the manner of men, though it is only a man's covenant. Yet if it is confirmed, no one annuls or adds to it. Now, to Abraham and to his seed were the promises made, and he does not say, and to seeds, as in plural, as of many, but of one, and to your seed who is Christ." So his point is, when the promise was made that there would be, you're going to bless the nations, that through you and through your seed the nations would be blessed. Well, he had a number of sons, but none of those were the ones who brought the blessing of eternity. None of them were. it had to have been a son of Abraham, but it wasn't going to be Isaac. It wasn't going to be Jacob. It wasn't going to be the sons of Jacob. It would be one who would come through Judah, the son of one of the sons of Jacob, the son Judah. It was through his line that the singular seed would come who would bring eternal life, that being Jesus, the Lion of the tribe of Judah. Okay, so that promise made to Abraham was never realized until the person of Jesus, born through the house of David, also of Judah. Okay, so we get the kind of the custody or the chain of custody. So he's able to say in verse 17, "And this I say, that the law, which was 430 years later, cannot annul the covenant that was confirmed before by God in Christ, that it should be made, that the promise would be made of no effect." It's a subtle thing that you might not catch here, but he's saying when he says this to Abraham, there was no law, right? So how could salvation come by the law when Abraham wasn't under the law? Now, these people in Moses' time, they walk with God according to what? It's the law, right? Because God said, here's what I expect. You go back to Abraham's time, there was no law. So how did he walk? Faith. Yeah, Abraham walked with God by faith. He believed the promises of God, and because he believed them, walked by faith, he was acceptable as far as God's concerned. That's what the Bible tells us. He was acceptable to him. So does that mean that the law is unacceptable? Of course not. God's the one who gave it to them. But ultimately, for it to be perfected in the person of Jesus Christ, we come back full circle to faith. We're not under the law. Abraham wasn't under the law. We work by faith. In between those things is a thing called the law that helps us to understand if you could do it by your works, this is how you would do it. And anybody that looks at that would go, but I can't do that. That's Paul's argument that he's building here. Look at verse 18. "For if the inheritance is of the law, then it is no longer a promise, but God gave that to Abraham by promise." It would be a matter of faith. And it would come through a person and not by your actions, but someone that will do so for you. So then, verse 19. "So then what purpose does the law serve? It was added because of transgression, until the seed should come to whom the promise was made. And it was appointed through angels by the hand of a mediator. And now a mediator does not mediate for one only, but God is one. Is the law then against the promises of God?" This is a great question. Is the law against the promises of God? Because remember, what was the promise? Through you the nations will be blessed, through your seed. How is that going to work out? Abraham couldn't have understood it entirely. The people under the law couldn't have understood it. Only people who have seen the finished work of Jesus, knowing what he taught, and the rest of the things like what we're reading here, only people after these times could look back historically and see the chronology of events and go, makes perfect sense now. He promised Abraham, through you, the nations, plural, generations of man would be blessed. Didn't happen because of the law. Had to have happened by something after the law. That something is a who. His name is Jesus. Who makes these offerings that we study tonight and will be studying, makes them of no effect. Because they were temporal and needed to be repeated. In Jesus, no such problem. That is how the nations are blessed. There is a one-time offering for sin, the book of Hebrews tells us, and it is in a person. So, we read on to this. "But the Scripture has confined all of us under sin, that the promise by faith in Jesus Christ might be given to those who believe." Isn't that cool? So then, verse 23, "But before faith came, we were kept under guard by the law." We don't usually think of it that way. This is a way that by keeping the law, it would be acceptable as far as God is concerned. There was a promise made to Abraham, and then God puts up, I always think of it this way, and if this is irreverent, I will ask forgiveness. I don't think of it as irreverent. The law was kind of like those little bumper things that they put up for the little kids at the bowling alley, so that you're not throwing gutter balls all the time. That's the law. It keeps you in your lane, right? Okay, so before faith came, we were kept under guard by the law, kept for faith which would afterward be revealed. Therefore, the law was our tutor, kept us in our lanes. And what would it do? Bring us to Christ Jesus, that we might be justified by faith. Right? So, the promise was made. We were given the standard of righteousness in the law. It was a guard for those people to keep them in a place of looking to God and staying right before Him, realizing that the day would come when we could stand rightly before Him because of the finished work of Jesus. It was our schoolmaster, our tutor, keeping us in line until that time. Now, let's remember, we were all born long after the finished work of Jesus, so the law to us has never served as a tutor, but remember the people to whom He is speaking. There are those that were coming into their midst and saying, you need to do this and you need to do that. They were putting salvation on the actions of the people. And He said, wait a minute, the law only did this much. It kept us in line until that time of faith came and until there was a perfect sacrifice that's made. That to them is in the rearview mirror. So don't go back to what will no longer be able to save you. That time has come to a close because all of the fulfillment made to Abraham has now come to light. It is full, it's complete, it's done. So again, as we study through Leviticus, as we go through this, let me at least read verse 25. But after faith has come, there is no longer a need. We are no longer under a tutor. We are people in the church who walk by faith. Do we discount anything in the law? Not hardly, because it helps us grasp in some ways what it is that we sometimes may take for granted of walking with God by faith and being a product of that faith in Him, grace ensues, and we don't need to do these things. I don't know about you. When I read just that first chapter, thank God. I am so thankful that I don't have to do those things, but I do not want it to be out of my mind the great cost that Jesus had to pay because of me. If no one else, He'd have done it for one of us, any one of us. Never forget that. Hugely important for us to recognize. So as we study through this, let that be the backdrop in your mind as you consider the text and all the rest of it, and just say, God, I'm so glad that you gave such specific instructions that were to be so carefully followed. And then we can look at it through the eyes of Christianity and realize we don't have the same list of do's and don'ts, but the cost was enormous. And so we are able to walk with Him of our own free will, knowing that He has completed this work of salvation. Absolutely amazing. That's just in the first chapter, which is amazing to me. And again, I will say in a mocking tone of those people who say we shouldn't bother studying or learning or teaching the Old Testament. Look at what they miss out on. These chapters help us in our understanding to come to grips with the depths of God's love. Oh my goodness. That He would spare us from having to do those things, and that He, remember this time around, what we understand, these people were bringing their own offerings. We don't do that. God is the one who has offered on behalf of us. And so we identify with that offering. Now what does He ask us to do? What do we bring now as our offering? What did I hear? You. Romans 12. I beseech you, brethren, by the mercies of God, that you present yourselves as living sacrifices, holy, acceptable to God, your reasonable service. Do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. Yeah? By the Spirit of the living God. Amen? Let's stand. And again, we have people down here. We'll be praying for you if you have need of prayer for anything. And if you get questions as we go through this, please don't be afraid to ask them. There are many that will come from this, and we will get an opportunity to look through this week by week and see why the offerings and why the sacrifices, and explain a little bit about them. They will all in some way point to the person of Jesus Christ. So this should be very, very encouraging and insightful as we go through it, learning His Word.